Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 6 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about waiver wire prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 6. Some of these players that can make immediate impacts and help you in your Week 6 matchups, while others will have far more longevity in order to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Some of these players benefiting from the fact that they had breakout performances, while others are going to benefit from the fact that unfortunate injuries took place during Week 5's contest. So we'll go ahead, talk about these players. I'll give you guys the statistics that justify the reasons as to why you want to go ahead and pick them up for your rosters going forward. Now, before we begin today's content, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We are very close of surpassing our goal of 70,000 subscribers. If in fact you can go ahead, take 2 seconds out of your day and help us get there. Of course, we're making daily fantasy football content all season long, of course, for the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Besides today's waiver wire video, we'll be doing a live stream later tonight after the Monday Night Football game between the Chiefs and Raiders in order to give you guys more help in terms of where we're going with our waivers, some trades that you could potentially make in order to help you out. So be sure to go ahead and join us later tonight after the game. Thank you very much. Also, for those of you who are just noticing this above my head, if you haven't yet already, be sure to check out PrizePicks. Again, if you sign up today using promo code Andrew, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So again, if you guys are trying to get more daily fantasy football to your fingertips, be sure to go ahead and check them out. Now, for those of you who are wondering what exactly is PrizePicks, let me go ahead and show you. Now, as you can see immediately to the right of me, we have PrizePicks. Now, for those of you who are trying to get more action and get more daily fantasy football at your fingertips, and you don't have anybody playing in tonight's game, you can go ahead and put together some entries for tonight's either first half or even the entirety of this game. Now, for those of you who feel confident one way or another regarding a statistic, you could potentially go ahead, pick Derek Carr, go ahead and pick Patrick Mahomes, pick more or less on their giving passing statistics, but it doesn't just, cap out at passing statistics. As you can see on screen, we have rushing, receiving yards, we have receptions, field goals made. I mean, the fact that we have Daniel Carlson here, and you could potentially go more or less on 1.5 field goals made. Again, we know that Daniel Carlson is one of the best kickers in the National Football League and continues to send those up. If this is going to be a higher scoring contest, we could see a lot of production from him in this singular category, picking more or less. Now, at the end of today's video, I'll go ahead and put together some entries and show you guys what I'm mainly confident in regards to tonight's Monday Night Football contest. So for those of you who are trying to go ahead and trail, you can go ahead and do so. Again, be sure to use promo code Andrew today. There's a link down in the description. When you make a first-time deposit and make an account, you can go ahead and get a first-time deposit match up to $100. So for those of you who are trying to play more fantasy football, be sure to do so today. Thank you very much. All right, so let's get into our Week 6 running back targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. Before we talk about specific players, I do want to remind you that the Raiders, the Houston Texans, the Detroit Lions, and the Tennessee Titans, all 4 of those teams will be on bye in Week 6. So if in fact you have any players that are going to be missing, you're going to have to go ahead, pick up potential prospects to fill their starting positions in order to help you out in Week 6. Let's go ahead and begin with our number one in the thumbnail for today's video. The player that is benefiting from an injury, it is Kenneth Walker. Unfortunately, we saw Rachaad Penny have a season-ending injury on Sunday against the New Orleans Saints. And that has been confirmed, and Kenneth Walker is going to be the primary back for this offense going forward. And there's a reason why many of us wanted to go ahead and pick up Kenneth Walker, because if in fact this was something that was going to take place, we talked about it during the preseason. If you're going ahead and drafting in those later rounds, pick up Kenneth Walker, because if an injury is to take place to Rachaad Penny, who had a storied injury, history throughout his entire NFL career, there's a lot of potential here for the RB1 of the Seattle Seahawks offense. And the offense as a whole have looked really good with Geno Smith over the course of the first 5 weeks of the NFL season. This all being said, I do want to remind you, of course, Kenneth Walker is a rookie running back, a 3rd-round pick out of Michigan State. There is a potential for him to immediately make an impact and find fantasy success, similar to the way that he did yesterday against the Saints. Again, it's a tough run-stopping defense, yet he was able to take 8 rushing attempts for 88 yards and a rushing touchdown. The reason why he was able to do so was, of course, the massive 69-yard rushing touchdown that he broke out late in that game in order to put this team up there and in the competing factor until, of course, Taysom Hill took over. We'll talk about Taysom Hill in just a little bit, but either way, right now, Kenneth Walker's only being rostered in 44% of leagues. Like you guys hear me talk about all the time, I typically want to mention players that are being rostered in less than 50% of leagues because it gives us a wider spectrum of opportunities for those of you who are listening. So again, he's the number one pickup of the week. No questions asked. If you have the number one waiver priority, if you have a lot of fab, go ahead and empty the clip. Kenneth Walker is the real deal moving forward. Let's talk about our number 2, Brian Robinson Jr. Again, Brian Robinson will have a short week and he'll be playing against the Chicago Bears this upcoming Thursday night. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention him once again, despite the fact that I've already mentioned him multiple times this season in terms of our weekly waiver wire prospects that we want to go ahead and pick up, and despite the fact that he's already rostered in 63% of Yahoo leagues, is because, again, from what we've seen just off of this last Sunday's game between the Washington Commanders and the Tennessee Titans, we saw Antonio Gibson only get 3 rushing attempts, while Brian Robinson got 9 of them. Of course, J.D. McKissic and Antonio Gibson got a lot of utilization in the receiving game. McKissic with 7 targets leading to 5 catches. Gibson, 4 targets leading to 3 catches. But ultimately, in terms of the running back of this team, first and second downs, that is going to be Brian Robinson's territory. This is a very talented back out of Alabama who is going to make immediate impact within this offense. And of course, they're taking on the Chicago Bears. It is a very favorable matchup in terms of the running game and how much rushing statistics they have allowed thus far this season on average. So Brian Robinson, for sure, pick him up. Moving on to Eno Benjamin. Now, Eno Benjamin has been mentioned multiple times already this season, but I want to once again mention it because there have been a lot of injuries that have taken place to the backfield in Arizona. Besides Darrell Williams going down with a knee injury, we also saw James Conner dealing with a rib injury. Now, Cliff Kingsbury has said, and I quote, he's okay. Now, I'm not 100% certain if that's going to be the case. They obviously want to be cautious with him. That was the overarching message that Cliff Kingsbury wanted to send. A couple weeks back, we also saw James Conner deal with an injury. And Cliff Kingsbury at the time had also said he's okay, we're just being very precautious with him. And he ended up playing the following week. I'm anticipating that James Conner is going to play going into week 6, which would be fantastic for our fantasy teams going up against the Seattle Seahawks run defense, which honestly isn't very good. So if in fact we could take advantage of it, perfect. But for those of you who are just trying to ensure that James Conner does have any setbacks, Eno Benjamin would be the next man up in this backfield. He did end up taking a rushing touchdown and having himself 4 targets in this last weekend's game against the Philadelphia Eagles. So there's a lot of opportunity to be had here, potentially with Eno Benjamin. Moving on. We have Rachaad White. We've mentioned him again for probably 3 consecutive weeks here in regards to Rachaad White having value because Leonard Fournette has so much opportunity in this backfield. If, in fact, Leonard Fournette continues to get utilized at this high rate, playing for majority of the game, there may be a potential where Leonard Fournette ends up missing time. I do want to mention this. Leonard Fournette has literally never played a full NFL season healthy. There's a reason why, is because, again, he plays aggressively and he takes a lot of hits. And as he continues to go ahead and put wear and tear on his body, starting back from 2017 now to 2022, there's a potential that he could miss time. So for those of you who are trying to ensure that the investment that you made in Leonard Fournette pans out going forward, you got to have Rachaad White on your team. Only rostered in 34% of leagues. That number should be way higher. There's a reason why. Rachaad White had 5 rushing attempts this past weekend, along with 4 targets leading to 3 catches. He's going to get a lot of utilization out of this backfield. We have to have him rostered just in case, for insurance purposes. Moving on, we talk about Mike Boone. Now, Mike Boone and or Latavius Murray could be put in this scenario. We could very easily have both of them here because we don't know what the distribution of opportunity is going to look like out of this Denver backfield. But what we saw on Thursday night of last week was Mike Boone and Melvin Gordon playing pretty well. Now, the reason why Latavius Murray didn't play last Thursday against the Indianapolis Colts is because he was coming off of a weekend game in London, in which, of course, it was a very relatively short week to immediately make an impact in that Denver game. Of course, trying to learn the offense and get everything ready to go. Going forward, Latavius Murray could very easily outplay Mike Boone. But the fact that Mike Boone had himself 10 fantasy points this last week in a half PPR, it's hard to ignore. That's why he's on number 5. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention, it is Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren, in fact, played the exact number of offensive snaps that Najee Harris did. They both played, I think, 37 or 38 snaps this past weekend against the Buffalo Bills defense, which is very concerning to me. Matt Canada, the offensive coordinator of this team, is quite literally destroying fantasy dreams in regards to Najee Harris. Jaylen Warren is only being rostered in 8% of leagues. He's a player that is coming off of a week in which he had 5 targets for 4 catches, had himself a lot of receiving yards. We've seen him already do that multiple times this season. And we even saw him have 5 total rushing attempts for 24 rushing yards. If, in fact, he continues to get more opportunities out of this backfield, by all means, he can continue to carve out his own workload that may make him a fantasy relevant back if anything is to happen to Najee Harris. That's why we go ahead, we pick up our handcuffs just in case, similar to the situation that many of us are dealing with in regards to Kenneth Walker and Rashad Penny. All right, that's going to cover the running back conversation. Let's go ahead and let's pivot to the wide receiver position, beginning with Jakobi Meyers, wide receiver of the New England Patriots. Now, Jakobi Meyers was questionable all week. We had no clue whether or not he was even going to play up until Sunday morning when we were finally given the designation that, yes, he's going to in fact play, which is fantastic because we want to go ahead and see The number one wide receiver of the New England Patriots offense, be active. And that's the thing. He is the number one wide receiver in the New England Patriots offense. And going forward, when Mac Jones returns, we're going to continue to see that. There's a reason why he led the team in targets last season. Mac Jones wants to continue to send him the ball. But even though this last weekend, it was Bailey Zappi at the starting quarterback position against the Detroit Lions, we saw a lot of success and a lot of opportunity going the direction of Jakobi Meyers. 8 targets, 7 catches, and 111 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, and 20.6 fantasy points. You know what's funny? The fact that Jakobi Meyers has not caught a touchdown from Mac Jones in his career thus far, and he's been able to catch a touchdown from Bailey Zappi and Brian Hoyer, it's poetry in the works. It's crazy. But either way, going forward, a wide receiver that's only rostered in 48% of leagues could be very valuable to our fantasy rosters. Moving on to our number 2, we have George Pickens. Again, if George Pickens is somehow available in your league still, please go ahead and pick him up. I know he is rostered in 55% of Yahoo leagues, but be sure to go ahead and have this man on roster, despite the fact that he has to take on Tampa Bay, Miami, and Philadelphia in the next 3 consecutive weeks, which is typically more of a difficulty for the quarterback position primarily. Kenny Pickett having to deal with those defenses and all the different looks that they're going to send at him, all the different pressures. I think that George Pickens is truly a star in the making. He is going to eventually be the number 2 wide receiver. I think he's already gotten to that point of being the number 2 wide receiver of this offense. Obviously, in terms of targets, Deontay Johnson is most likely going to maintain the number 1 option within this offense, but Chase Claypool is all but done in my opinion. George Pickens playing extremely well, back-to-back weeks of having himself over 80 receiving yards, and going forward, the numbers should continue to climb as his relationship and his rapport with Kenny Pickett continues to get that much cleaner in the season. Moving on to Isaiah McKenzie, our number 3. Even though Isaiah McKenzie did not participate in this last weekend's contest against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, we saw Khalil Shakir, the rookie wide receiver who filled in for him, 5 targets, 3 catches, 75 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 15 fantasy points. There is so much value to be had in this Buffalo Bills offense. There's a reason why Gabriel Davis could catch the ball 3 times and literally have 170 plus receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Unbelievable numbers across the board for all those receiving options within the Bills offense. And going forward, they take on the Kansas City Chiefs this upcoming week. This should be a very high scoring event, as we all anticipate, because the last time we saw these two teams participate was in the NFL playoffs, and that was an absolute shootout. If Isaiah McKenzie's back from his concussion protocol, a player that is only rostered in 48% of leagues does have incredible value, because the last couple weeks that we saw him play, 3 out of those 4 games, he had scored a touchdown. I think those numbers are going to continue to be there. Moving on to Michael Gallup. Now, Michael Gallup is mainly an investment for the future, a guy that is currently rostered in 51% of leagues. We want to go ahead and have him on roster once, in fact, Dak Prescott returns. Because once Dak returns, we're going to see these wide receivers elevate in terms of their overall production, based on the fact that right now, with Cooper Rush, yes, they're getting the job done, but there's so much more upside to be had. Let's not forget, just look at this last weekend's game against the LA Rams. Cooper Rush had himself 10 completions on 16 passing attempts. Only 10 completions is not going to get the job done for tight ends, running backs, or receivers in terms of fantasy football within a singular offense. So, once in fact, Dak Prescott returns, Michael Gallup will get himself a lot of value going forward as a number 2 of this offense, which we have seen in prior seasons be very high upside going forward. Moving on to Rondale Moore, our number 5. Now, Rondale Moore is a good fantasy prospect. He's pretty much absorbing all the utilization that we saw Greg Dortch pretty much pick up from weeks 1 through 3. And Rondale Moore now at a healthier position. 8 targets, 7 catches, 68 receiving yards. A pretty decent week for fantasy football purposes. Only rostered in 18% of leagues. My only concern is once, in fact, DeAndre Hopkins returns, we're going to probably see Rondale Moore disappear. Because the hierarchy of targets within this offense is going to go DeAndre Hopkins, Marquise Hollywood-Brown, then Zach Ertz, then we're going to get to Rondale Moore, and or maybe the running back position, whoever steps up at that given moment in time. So there is going to be a lot of target competition for him, but I guess for this upcoming week, if in fact you need a wide receiver fill-in, he could be a fantastic option going against the Seattle Seahawks secondary. Moving on to Josh Reynolds. Now, I know Josh Reynolds is going on a bye week, but I do want to mention it because this is 3 consecutive weeks. I think it's actually 4 consecutive weeks of double-digit fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Josh Reynolds, his connection with Jared Goff continues to maintain relatively strong, and the fact that we saw very little utilization out of Amon-Ra St. Brown speaks to the fact that he is still dealing with that injury, and even after this bye week, that may continue to plague him going forward. Josh Reynolds continues to be the guy going forward in this offense that I want to have as that sneaky wide receiver 3 play for this Detroit Lions offense that really, even though they got shut out last week, we're able to get him the ball a relatively good amount of times down the field. 10 targets. All right, let's go ahead and move on and talk about wide receivers a little bit lower down the list. Guys that have a lower percentage in terms of rostership and potentially may not be as impactful going forward, but I still want to mention these guys. Let's talk about Alec Pierce. Alec Pierce is very quickly becoming one of Matt Ryan's favorite options within this offense. 8 receptions, 81 receiving yards this last week against the Denver Broncos defense. Of course, they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars defense this upcoming week, and the hope is that, of course, because they're playing in Indianapolis this time, we're not going to see as much of a complete sham of an offense like we saw the last time this team took on Jacksonville earlier this season, just a couple of weeks ago. Alec Pierce, a fantastic option available in 92% of Yahoo leagues. Available for you to go ahead and pick up. Now, Jahan Dotson's our number 8, mainly because he could be switched out with Dyami Brown. Now, both these wide receivers are kind of filling into that position where in that certain role, Carson Wentz loves to throw them touchdowns. There's a reason why Dyami Brown came away with 2 touchdowns this last weekend. And of course, Jahan Dotson has scored a boatload of touchdowns already this year. Of course, they didn't want to go ahead and put a timetable on his injury. So if in fact you are trying to recoup some of this value, Dyami Brown could be the guy to go after. Otherwise, Jahan Dotson, once he returns from the hamstring injury, could be of service to us. Now, Darius Slayton is our number 9. This offense as a whole, with Kenny Golladay, pretty much irrelevant, I would say. Sterling Shepard, season-ending injury. Of course, Kadarius Toney has hamstring injuries in both legs. I mean, he's pretty much in a wheelchair at this point. Darius Slayton is pretty much stepping up as the number 1, and that's exactly what we saw in London against the Green Bay Packers defense. 7 targets, 6 catches, 79 yards. If he's going to continue to get this level of opportunity, he will be able to step up because we have seen him do it in the past. My hope is that the consistency of those opportunities are there for fantasy purposes. Moving on to Randall Cobb, our number 10. As of right now, the fact that Randall Cobb came away with 13 targets is concerning for Romeo Doubs and Allen Lazard. If those guys aren't getting consistent opportunities and we're going to spread it around this offense, it definitely is going to hurt in terms of picking a for sure starter within a given week. As of right now, again, only rostered in 3% of leagues, could be an option for those of you who are extremely desperate in a deeper league. Moving on to Donovan Peoples-Jones, another one of these options within this Cleveland Browns offense that, of course, is finding himself open and could have value not only for the next couple weeks, but when, in fact, we do see Deshaun Watson return later in the season, could be of pretty high value. The final player I wanted to mention, it is Jameson Williams, the rookie wide receiver, who did sustain an ACL injury in his final year at college. Of course, was a first-round pick. Could have very easily been the first wide receiver taken off the board if, in fact, he didn't sustain that ACL injury. As a part of the Detroit Lions offense, and the fact that the offense, as this team has kind of progressed throughout the season, has looked good in terms of passing the ball, there is a lot of potential where Jameson Williams may be available. You can throw him into your injured reserve spot, and when in fact he returns, could be of value. All right, moving on to the tight end position. Let's begin with Hayden Hurst. Now, he's coming off of a week against the Baltimore Ravens Sunday Night Football, 6 catches, 53 yards, a touchdown, 14.3 fantasy points. With T. Higgins dealing with an injury, pretty much not playing after the second quarter, it leads me to believe that Hayden Hurst, Tyler Boyd, they're going to continue to see more opportunities within this offense. And if those opportunities continue to rise, a lot of fantasy production is going to come out of it, especially in the red zone for Hayden Hurst. Let's move on to Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill is in a tricky situation. The fact that they didn't have Jarvis Landry, Jameis Winston, and Michael Thomas, and also Chris Olave left the game with a concussion. If you guys saw, that was brutal. That in itself leads me to believe that they had nowhere else to go but Taysom Hill. And there's a reason why, besides throwing a passing touchdown, he was able to have 9 rushing attempts for 112 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. He's currently rostered in 29% of leagues, and I do want to mention him in regards to, yes, you may be able to pick him up and find some sort of value, but it is so sketchy right now. If those other options return, Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, Chris Olave, of course we saw Alvin Kamara back, if Jameis Winston returns, there may be less of a willingness from this team to want to continue to give him rushing attempts. But maybe they continue to make him a streamlined option as he's finding so much success, and the run blocking for this team is so good thus far this season, coming off a 34-point fantasy performance. Quite frankly, he's a tight end, but he doesn't catch any passes, which is just so weird. Moving on. We have Evan Engram as our number 3. He takes on the Indianapolis Colts this week, and he's coming off of a pretty relevant week against Houston, in which he had 10 targets, 6 catches, 69 yards, 9.9 fantasy points. Of course, earlier this year, when we saw him take on the Indianapolis Colts, he had himself 8 targets, 7 catches, 46 receiving yards. There has been a progression towards trying to get him the ball more often every single week, and we're beginning to see that. Player currently rostered in only 24% of leagues could be an option for you, for those of you who have a tight end on bye week. For example, Darren Waller, TJ Hawkinson going into this upcoming weekend's contest. Moving on to Cade Otton, the rookie tight end. Now, of course, we saw him step up and be the starter for this team in conjunction with Kyle Rudolph due to the fact that Cameron Brate was out due to a concussion. Now, if in fact this rookie wide receiver has earned himself more opportunities within this offense, he could very easily be the starter going forward in terms of a receiving sense. Having 7 targets, 6 catches, 43 yards this past Sunday, now they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers, which in my opinion is a pretty good matchup for the tight end position. Cade Otton, another one of these players that could be available in your league. Moving on to Noah Fant. Now, the issue that I have with Noah Fant isn't his skill. It's a matter of the opportunity within this offense. If Will Disley is going to be the primary red zone threat, that does hurt the potential of Noah Fant. But as long as he continues to see more and more utilization in terms of opportunity, in terms of snap counts, he's a guy that, again, we have seen find success in fantasy football in seasons past with the Denver Broncos. It's only a matter of time where he has himself a couple big performances here for us. Moving on to the final player at the tight end position that I wanted to mention, it is Robert Tonyan. Robert Tonyan, again, he's getting a little bit more targets. He is probably rostered in your league already. But outside of him, there really isn't anyone else that I wanted to mention at the tight end position that I feel confident about. So we'll make him my number 6. If you're desperate enough, you can add him. But otherwise, the matchup, the opportunity, it's not just there yet for us to feel confident enough with Robert Tonyan. Moving on, let's talk about the quarterback position, beginning with Geno Smith. Man, Geno Smith has been incredible in fantasy football. 3 consecutive weeks of being one of the best quarterback, producers within that given week. That in itself is unbelievable. 24 fantasy points this last weekend against the New Orleans Saints defense. Now he has a privilege of taking on a division rival in the Arizona Cardinals. He is by far and away the number 1 quarterback that I want to pick up if in fact I am in need of someone to go ahead and fill in to my roster because I don't have Derek Carr available, Ryan Tannehill, Jared Goff. Geno Smith is the guy that I'm picking up and I'm playing once again, coming off of another week of 3 touchdowns. My goodness, he's just playing so well. It's hard to ignore. Moving on to Carson Wentz, the next option I wanted to mention at the quarterback position. They play on a relatively short week, but they do have the advantage of taking on the Chicago Bears defense. Of course, Carson Wentz finally came back to life this last week against the Tennessee Titans defense, in which he had 359 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. If we're going to continue to see this Carson Wentz, where he's throwing the ball, again, nearly 40 times per game, and we're in the conversation of him, of course, scoring touchdowns via the passing game, despite the fact that, of course, in week 3 and 4, we didn't see any of that because, of course, they were playing against Dallas and Philadelphia, tougher defenses. I think the Chicago defense is in a position where they will be giving him fantasy points. He will be earning it and potentially putting our fantasy teams in the right position. Moving on to Marcus Mariota. Marcus Mariota had a better week than I anticipated. Of course, a lot of the rushing statistics that he gained saved his overall fantasy week contribution. 61 rushing yards on 7 attempts. Of course, with having no Cordero Patterson or Kyle Pitts in the lineup, they still managed to be relatively competitive in that contest. Now they take on the San Francisco 49ers defense, who is coming off of a week in which they lost, I think, 4 starters. A lot of injuries in the secondary specifically. Of course, Bosa is dealing with an injury. There may be a conversation where the Atlanta Falcons could keep this close, keep this a competitive game. And if Kyle Pitts returns, Marcus Mariota could be a fantastic starting option this week. Moving on to Jimmy Garoppolo in that same matchup. Of course, we expect Jimmy Garoppolo to sit back behind this great offensive line and just let the ball loose and let the receiving options within this team gain the yardage and set him up for success fantasy-wise. Of course, having 253 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns this last Sunday isn't something that we're going to expect from him every single week, but considering he is taking on the Atlanta Falcons secondary, it is a decent enough option for us, for those of you who are desperate. Moving on to Mac Jones. Now, we're not 100% certain that Bailey Zappi is not going to once again be the starting quarterback in Week 6, because again, Mac Jones is still coming off of that high ankle sprain, which is quite significant from all that we've heard. But if Mac Jones wants to go ahead, be limited to practice, potentially get a full practice in by Friday, and is named the starter, I think he's a fantastic option going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Cleveland Browns. That secondary, that defense as a whole has definitely struggled all season long. And the way that we have seen the New England Patriots kind of prepare for teams, and especially against teams that typically aren't considered to be the best, like the Detroit Lions, yet have found recent success, I think there's very much so a shelf for that going up against the Cleveland Browns. Yes, they've won some games, but I think they could very easily be exposed, and Mac Jones could definitely end up doing that this week with the help of Bill Belichick. Moving on to Jacoby Brissett. Now, speaking of the Cleveland Browns, Jacoby Brissett, honestly, hasn't been that bad. I ended up starting him in a Superflex league this past weekend. I might end up actually winning that contest, considering his contributions, again, week in and week out, are pretty decent. If you're desperate enough and are looking for a quarterback, He's a decent option as the final quarterback that I wanted to mention. Let's move on to kicker and special teams, beginning with Graham Gano. Over the last 4 consecutive weeks, his fantasy point contributions, 17, 15, 10, and 10. Rostered in 21% of leagues, that's all I got to say. Moving on to Jason Myers, his fantasy point contributions in the last couple weeks, 11, 14, 10. Like I mentioned, the Seattle Seahawks continue to score a high volume of points. They take on Arizona this week. Pretty decent option. Moving on to Mason Crosby. They take on the Jets. Advantageous matchup in my opinion. He's put up 9 and 10 points in each of the last 2 weeks. 11% rostership. Again, if for those of you who are missing out from a kicker this upcoming week and you need one to pick up and play, these are 3 decent options with pretty wide ranges of availability. Moving on to defenses, let's talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars taking on the Indianapolis Colts. If in fact the Colts are not going to have Jonathan Taylor or potentially Nyheim Hines, this could be another game in which the Jacksonville Jaguars defense can make it very difficult for Matt Ryan to succeed and get a lot of points via their defense. Moving on, we talk about the Minnesota Vikings. Of course, they will be taking on the Miami Dolphins defense. Now, the Miami Dolphins may not have Teddy Bridgewater or Tua Tagovailoa this week. And if they're going to have their 3rd string, 7th round quarterback pick sitting there at the starting quarterback position, that could be very detrimental to their team. Minnesota Vikings, not a bad option. The final defense I wanted to mention is the Washington Commanders. They play on Thursday night against Justin Fields. Could be a matchup in which they can take advantage of that offensive line, put a lot of pressure on him, and force some turnovers. Again, a lot of the defenses that are available this week that I just mentioned are probably rostered already in your league. If they're not, go ahead and take advantage of it. But because we are already getting into the position of a lot of bye weeks and we have a lot of higher scoring matchups based on the fact that we have 2 teams like the Bills versus the Chiefs. Typically, we start both those defenses, but because they're playing one another, it becomes that much more difficult to trust one over the other, respectively. All right, with all that mentioned, now we can go ahead and talk about some prize pick entries that we can go ahead and make for tonight's Monday Night Football game, getting a little bit more action. For those of you who are interested, again, be sure to go down to the description of the video today, click on the link, or use promo code Angie. When you sign up and make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. It's a great way to support the channel and, of course, bring daily fantasy to your fingertips. All right, so as you can see on screen, we have a plethora of different statistics that we can pick from. You can even go ahead and pick the first half of games and specific statistics that are going to be gained within the first half of tonight's game. But let's go ahead and let's talk about it in a broader spectrum. In terms of receiving touchdowns, in terms of receiving or potential rushing yards, I like Clyde Edwards to get himself a touchdown. In each of the last 2 games that he's played against the Las Vegas Raiders defense, he has scored 2 touchdowns in each of those contests. Not only that, thus far this season, he has been a touchdown machine, continuing to find the end zone and a lot of value in that regard. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick more on that overall. Now, when we go ahead and move on, I want to also mention other Kansas City Chiefs because I very much so feel confident in this Chiefs offense continuing to put it on the Las Vegas Raiders defense, specifically in the form of Travis Kelce. I like his more in terms of his receiving yards. When I go ahead and look at the game scripts in which Travis Kelce's played against the Las Vegas Raiders as of late, in 4 out of the last 6 games that he's played against his defense, he's put up 100 or more receiving yards. I'm going ahead and taking more in terms of the 72.5 receiving yard total there. Now, for example, we have ourselves a power play here. If we're able to get both of these correct, we go ahead and 3 times our overall entry. Not only that, I kind of wanted to add a little bit more to this because I truly do believe in terms of receptions, there could be a lot of value to be had via Davante Adams. I think Davante Adams could be in a position where he surpasses this number. Now, mainly because when we look at the secondary of this team, they're quite inexperienced and they've given up a lot of statistics to opposing wide receivers. So I could technically add this to our overall entry, but because I need another player from a different team within this entry, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pivot in the direction of Daniel Carlson. I know this team wants to kick the ball. They're going to kick some field goals. They're going to get in field position. So I'm going to go ahead and say that he is able to go ahead and make 2 field goals in this game. I'm going with the more. If I'm able to go ahead and make a $10 entry and 5 times my overall entry. All right, that's going to cover it for today's video. Thank you everybody for watching. Again, be sure to use promo code Andrew via PrizePicks. Down in the description, there's a link. If you go ahead, sign up today, make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. You deposit 10, you'll be given 10. You deposit 50, you'll be given 50, up to $100. So for those of you who are interested, and of course, getting more daily fantasy at your fingertips, be sure to check that out. Tomorrow, we'll have our running back rankings video for week 6 available. Do not forget, later tonight after the Monday Night Football game, I will be live streaming here on the channel, answering some waiver wire questions in regards to some of these players and some of the trades that you guys could potentially make to improve your roster. So I'll be here. For those of you who want to join us, thank you very much. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.